I'm very pleased to be here. I actually rarely get to speak with other designers, so this is kind of a treat. I feel like I get to speak my own language, and I don't have to explain what human factors is or need finding, so this is good. But with that said, I still have trouble with terminology and definitions, and I had a really hard time even just naming this talk. How many people have heard of the terms design for social innovation, or design for social impact, design for the BOP, BOP being bottom of the pyramid? And I struggled because I honestly don't understand these terms myself, and I'm supposed to be someone who's deep into this field, but a lot of the terms just don't make sense to me. And I figured there was probably going to be people in this audience who are using terms to either teach students or to do the work that they're doing, and I'd love to hear them because I think it will help me as well. For those of you who don't have a definition though, for some context, applying design methodology to social challenges. And I got my first taste of this thought and this idea back in 2001, when my history and philosophy of design professor had us read Natural Capitalism. And Natural Capitalism for me was a first. It was the first book that I read that really challenged the status quo in terms of how we as designers create our built environment. It was the first time that I'd heard of these concepts of end of life, of inspiration from nature and biomimicry, design for efficiency. And it was really through my professor's lectures and the readings that he selected that I began to appreciate how powerful we are as designers, because not only do we create culture with the artifacts that we're creating for our jobs, all those small, seemingly minute decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis, those have dramatic impacts and effects on people around the world that we'll probably never meet. Social impact, both positive and negative. And this was such a cool thought to me because growing up, I mean, they mentioned I was up on the res, I was surrounded by the negative societal, by many negative societal inputs, like poverty, like alcoholism, and environmental degradation. And I thought, oh, how cool, as a designer, I'm learning these skills that could possibly have some sort of impact on those sorts of societal issues. But it took me a few years to really find an outlet to practice these ideas and put it into my work, specifically within the context of international development. And I think when people think about international development, they're not really thinking about designers, they're thinking about, you know, these mega philanthropy organizations, advocacy groups, policymakers. No one really associates designers with development, but I think it's actually a pretty natural fit, because if you think about it, we're advocates too. We're advocates for people. We're trained to think about how to make life easier for people, how to conceptualize the ideal. And for me, I mean, the social issue that I chose was poverty. And people always ask me, why poverty? Because it's so big, it's so intangible. And honestly, I think it can be a little annoying, because it's those ones that you hear about all the time, and you know that it exists, but you feel kind of helpless to really do anything about. And so that was my first challenge, was to find a way to make poverty physical and concrete. And as a product designer, what I could do, I could create physical tools that might help someone without a lot of money earn more. And when I talk about people, this is the type of person that I'm talking about. So typically it's somebody who's rural, meaning they're physically inaccessible. Someone who has maybe $10 a year to spend on luxury items like soap. Someone who comes from a large family, probably has a minimum level of education. So to get back to these myths or misconceptions that I'm going to talk about, my mom sends me article clippings and newspaper clippings about my industry all the time, and I get a lot of emails from aspiring designers, designers in transition, a lot of jaded designers, and they all want to know, what does it mean to design for the BOP? So the talk that I prepared is kind of a reaction to all those emails, all of those phone calls, all the conversations I've had since I started in this space in 2005, specifically around 7 misconceptions about this design for social impact, design for the BOP space. Myth number 1 is this term itself for me. I mean, design for the BOP is a specific sector. Harping on terminology again, because for me what this implies, based on the questions that I get from people, is that somehow the design methods that you use to design for poor people is somehow different than what you learn in school, or somehow different than what you've learned on the job. And it's not. So before I started Catapult, I was working in industry for about 6 years as a product design consultant. And one of my biggest clients was in the power tool industry. So I spent several days in the field with construction workers, specifically drywall installers. And I would spend my days observing how they use the tools, their preferences, their techniques, the language that they use, and they talked about what they were doing, how they trained new drywall installers. And I even had a go at installing drywall myself with this crazy archaic tool from the 40s that they still use in the drywalling installation world. But what I took away from this was, drywalling installation is kind of this subculture that exists within this much larger culture of construction workers, both of which I knew absolutely nothing about. And I've had the same experience when I go to another country and there's all these subcultures and cultures ingrained and living within one another that I know nothing about. In either case, I'm an outsider that knows absolutely nothing. But the point is, I use the same observational methods, the same research methods in both places. So a good designer in general never assumes and always applies good design methodology, whether your customer is a drywaller from Mexico or a mother of 5 in Rwanda. So to quash this myth number 1, there's no extra or secret design methods you need to learn in order to work in this space. Myth number 2, designing for needs warrants success. One of the very first classes we had in school was around need finding. And I'd mentioned before that my mom sends me articles and magazine clippings, and they're almost always about a solar cook stove project, like this one here in Chad, or about a group of students that designed a super cool water filtration device for a community. And I read all of them with a healthy dose of skepticism because I have to. Because this industry, I feel like more than any other, is filled with People magazine hero stories. But what they rarely follow up with is what happens to these projects for the long run. And the vast majority of them fail, even those that are developed around a compelling need statement. And they fail because people aren't thinking about the walkaway test, meaning once you implement your product or once you implement your service and you leave the community, that it continues to thrive and grow in your absence. So the misconception here is that designing for a specific need is enough to make a design successful, and it's not. User adoption, distribution, maintenance of these systems all require a long-term sustainability strategy. Here's a pretty good test. So the next time you meet somebody who's working on a super cool-sounding project, ask them, how many of your, fill in the blank here, water filters or whatever, are still in use 1 year, 2 years, 5 years later? Not, how many have you sold? That really means nothing. Or how many cool features does it have? That ultimately means nothing. So to debunk myth number 2, good design isn't all that you need to make these projects successful. It's also about how well you've thought through all the external factors that are going to impact the project once you leave. Myth number 3, it's a one-way street. There's a tendency to view this sector as philanthropic and humanitarian. I think because we can't help but think that any work being done in developing countries is anything but philanthropic and humanitarian. The assumption here, I guess, is that as Westerners, we're coming in to bring our expertise or to implement systems based on Western schemas. And I think for those of you who've been to some of these countries, you know that that's absolutely not true. That in fact, countries in Africa are completely leapfrogging the US in spaces like green innovation. With cell phones and mobile banking, they're completely bypassing telephone pole infrastructure, paper-based monetary systems. You can't find incandescent bulbs here. It's CFL LED all the way. I mean, we can't get most of the country to recycle, but recycling has been ingrained in the culture here for decades. And then there's all this other cool stuff going on, like India and Nicaragua both have innovative financing models for solar home energy systems. Tanzania and Guatemala have like a Netflix kind of service for household items like batteries. So while we're, using our iPhones to tweet about our turkey sandwich, people on the other side of the world are using their dumb phones to transfer money to somebody in another country, to make a purchase at the market, to check market prices on the other side of the world and apparently to topple regimes too. So it's not a one-way street. And in fact, there's many opportunities in all cultures to cross-pollinate the best ideas that create a more sustainable world. Myth number 4, project work in the social sector is more rewarding. I did a practice talk with my friends, and they're like, get rid of this one, it's too negative. I didn't mean for it to be negative. This is clearly a very subjective myth, I know that, and I definitely find my work rewarding, that's not what I'm trying to say. But there's aspects of what I do that I struggle with that I wish someone had prepared me for, or at least told me about. When I'm in country, for example, I'm not always prepared for the challenges that I'm going to see. I see things, a lot of things, that are difficult for me to understand, difficult to process, difficult to come to terms with, and just kind of say, that's how it is, I can't do anything about that, and I have to take it home with me. And I'm also not blessed with patience at all. And I have to actively remind myself that many of the goals that I'm trying to accomplish in this industry are probably not going to be accomplished within my lifetime, that change happens at its own pace in different parts of the world, that most of the changes that I'm talking about are generational changes. And of course, people challenge me. Many of the people that I work with have been promised things by outside organizations in the past, and rightfully so, they're very frustrated because not a lot of movement happens, and sometimes I end up with the brunt of that frustration. And I also struggle with everything that comes with being in the public sector in the US. I think the biggest one for most organizations is having to pull teeth to get funding for projects that you know are worthwhile, and then reading in Google News the next day that so-and-so just got $2 million for a Super Bowl commercial. And then there's the kind of like this under the microscope feeling. A lot of the projects we do are under scrutiny, not just by clients and end users, but also colleagues, funders, the media. And these are all external challenges that I didn't realize would be part of working in this sector, and I kind of wish somebody had told me. So to address myth number 4, while this work is personally rewarding, for me, it has really challenged a lot of my beliefs, definitely thickened my skin, and I've really had to have the personal conviction to affirm why I'm here. Okay, so moving on from that. Myth number 5, the objective is change. We all love stories about how family living in darkness now has access to LED lighting, or about how a simple, clean water technology turned a sickly community healthy. And it's easy to think that our objective is that immediate change. But it's actually the tip of a much bigger objective, the ultimate objective of development, and that's to build capacity. There's a really great quote by Ezio Manzini that says, "You don't ask what you can do to make people behave differently. You ask what you can do to recognize people's capabilities and use those to solve the problems that they face." And then he goes on to say, the term for designers who are ultimately looking to create change should be design for capabilities, or design for empowerment. And this really does, at least for me, change your outlook on the problem statement. Enabling people to meet their potential, whether they be rich or whether they be poor, is ultimately what creates that social change. I have to create the opportunity to work in this space. So I teach, and I get this a lot from my students because I have set a bad example. This is what I was thinking in 2005, and this is what I did when I created my company, but this isn't the case anymore. And I guess the precursor to this is, I'm a designer. I love design. I love that process of conceptualize something in the brain and bringing it into physical reality. And you could argue that's exactly what I'm doing with Catapult, and I would argue that the mechanics are entirely different now. As the leader of a company, I feel like I mostly do this, and I also do a lot of business development, which honestly isn't that fun. But I do a lot of outreach, education, advocacy. I rarely get to do the design work anymore. So all I'm doing now is create opportunity for other people to work in this space. But it's no longer the case. There are an amazing number of opportunities now for designers to grow in this space, and it's growing. I hope that it will continue to grow. But for example, CGAP and World Bank have both launched product initiatives. International Development Enterprise launched HCD labs in Southeast Asia later this year. UNICEF launched innovation labs last year. The African Leadership Academy hires designers to teach design thinking and entrepreneurship to students in South Africa. So you don't have to fall into my trap anymore, and I hope that there will continue to be an increasing number of opportunities for designers to work in this space and not have to build it from scratch. And the next myth is the one I get the most of for sure. As a designer, I'm not as valuable as ... And I think this is again because when you think of international development, you don't think of designers. Most of the people I meet know that they have something to contribute, but they're just not sure how it fits within the context. So here are 5 of your many strengths that I think you can use to sell yourself. 1, you're a systems thinker. And the problems that plague our world are complex systems problems. And as a designer, you're ultimately a problem solver. You can leverage both the creative and analytical sides of the brain, and it's going to take both to really address many of these social challenges. And 2, you're a creative thinker armed with design. And Einstein said, we can't solve the world's problem by using the same type of thinking when we created them. Most of the social challenges, again, that we're facing today in the US and worldwide have existed for decades and decades because we have been using the same type of prescriptive thinking for decades and decades, and we're long overdue for fresh thinking. 3, you have an iterative process. We make a lot of mistakes in development, and these are mistakes that negatively impact billions of poor people. Mistakes that could have been prevented if this industry adopted a culture of prototyping and refining ideas instead of throwing millions of dollars into a single failed idea, which is kind of the status quo now. And 4, you're user-driven. So many of the decisions made today that affect these billions of poor people are made by people completely removed from their issues. And you, as a designer, you're driven by your understanding of this person, of this end user. You're an advocate for the user, and that's a perspective and a voice that's completely missing within international development. And then 5, you create capacity. So by building things, whether they be products, services, or a website, you are intrinsically building the capacity of those who make, distribute, sell, or use what you're creating. And that's what economic development is all about. And we need more people doing that in a sustainable way. So to wrap this up, I had 2 thoughts. 1, if the design for BOP, design for social impact space is going to move beyond a trend and beyond a movement into a standard, then we need to quash this idea that there's only a few people working in this space, or it's those people over there that are doing this stuff. I want to get to a point where you don't headline the evening news, or you don't get invited to speak at Cusp just because you designed a wheelchair-accessible ramp in your hometown, or designed a wind turbine for rural families. There should be nothing exclusive or nothing special about doing good. It should just be. And second, we, everyone in this room, we designers, we create the social challenges of tomorrow with the buildings that we design, with the objects we create, the systems that we vote into place. Poverty, homelessness, unemployment, these are all testaments to those failed systems. Poverty, the state of being for, I think, 6 out of 10 people in this world. There's no reason it should exist at all, given the state of technology and given the state of developed societies. But the system is broken, and now more than ever, we need creative people. We need designers working in the social sector to help unravel all of these complexities and rethink how we address these social challenges. And I imagine there's several people here that are doing that. And if there's anything I can do to help you, or anything I can do to help more people get in this space, then I'm happy to do that. It's why I'm here. So thanks so much for having me.